Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Michael was getting ready for another show with his new band, Midnight Highway. It was one of those nights that felt completely ordinary, nothing special, just another gig at the Rusty Lantern, a bar where musicians went hoping to get noticed. While tuning his guitar backstage, his mind was somewhere else: bills to pay, unfinished songs, scattered memories of a life he was still trying to piece together. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until she walked into the bar. Jenna arrived with a friend, the kind of person whose presence changes the room even without saying a word. Michael first noticed her between songs, when his focus shifted from the stage to the crowd. But the moment their eyes met, something inside him stirred. She was different from any woman he'd ever paid attention to. During the break, she went up to the bar, and without knowing why, he decided to walk over. They started talking easily, naturally. It felt like they'd known each other for years. She talked about old books and orchestra concerts, and he told her about chords and garage recordings. Their worlds seemed different, but somehow they fit. The following week, she invited him to something completely outside his usual routine, a symphony concert. Michael hesitated, but said yes. Sitting beside her, surrounded by violins and flutes, he realized there was beauty in things he'd never allowed himself to feel before. The way Jenna listened, eyes closed and a small smile on her lips, made him want to know her beyond bar conversations. After the concert, they walked together and opened up more than they'd planned. Michael talked about his lonely childhood and his distant relationship with his father, and Jenna shared how her mother taught her to notice the details others overlooked. That night became the first chapter of something that promised to grow. The weeks that followed were full of discoveries. Michael, who usually got involved with intense but short-lived relationships, was surprised by Jenna's consistency. They argued sometimes, sure, because he was impulsive and she was more cautious, but they always laughed about it afterward. Conflicts turned into lessons. Once, he showed up late to her birthday and found the table empty. He thought she'd left, but she came back with 2 milkshakes and said it was okay, as long as he never lied. Another time, he almost cancelled a planned weekend when an important producer called with a last-minute opportunity. Jenna didn't get angry, she just said she'd wait for him to decide what he wanted to build, a career, or a life with someone. And he chose to be with her. Months passed, and their relationship naturally deepened into something more serious. Michael felt secure. It wasn't blind passion, but a solid connection. They were syncing their routines, learning each other's flaws, and figuring out how to live with silence. When he decided to propose, it wasn't at an expensive restaurant or during a fancy trip. It was on her couch, after watching an old movie. He simply pulled the ring from his pocket and told her he knew what he wanted for the rest of his life. She laughed, then cried, and said yes. He hugged her, and for a few seconds, everything felt perfectly in place. Jenna became part of the band's rehearsals, part of his family, part of his daily life. She helped him organize contracts, gave feedback on songs, brought tea when he lost his voice, and left encouraging notes in his instrument case. Friends noticed how different he seemed, less explosive, more grounded. He looked happy. And he was. For the first time in years, Michael believed he'd found someone he could share not just the present with, but all the tomorrows that hadn't happened yet. But as with anything that starts too perfectly, there was a shadow he chose to ignore. A name that occasionally came up in casual conversation. A past Jenna claimed she'd left behind. Derek Johnson. Michael pretended it didn't bother him, that it wasn't a threat, that trust mattered more than jealousy. And maybe it did. Still, there was something about that half-told story he never fully understood. Even so, he kept moving forward. Because he was in love. And because he believed that sometimes, love was enough. Michael never liked goodbyes, especially when uncertainty was involved. Watching Jenna pack for her permanent move to Charlotte left a bitter taste in his mouth that even her words couldn't wash away. It was a great professional opportunity, she explained, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to lead a new project that would solidify her career. He knew that. He also knew that, as hard as it would be, he needed to support her. But distance would test everything they'd built so far. The first few days were filled with messages, video calls, promises of frequent visits. Michael tried to fill the emptiness by throwing himself into band work and keeping his mind busy. Jenna, meanwhile, seemed excited about the new challenges, but also tired, torn between a demanding schedule and the growing weight of missing him, something that slowly became a burden for both of them. Still, they kept trying. It was during one of those calls that she mentioned, almost carelessly, that Derek had been transferred to a nearby city. She said it was a coincidence, that she only found out after accepting the new job. Michael froze inside but pretended not to care. He wanted to avoid unnecessary arguments, so he just listened. He tried to trust, mentally repeating that the past was in the past, that their present was strong. But that piece of information kept nagging at him like a pebble in his shoe. As the weeks passed, something changed. Messages became less frequent. Her replies grew shorter, farther apart, almost robotic. When they video called, Jenna seemed distracted, distant. There was always a new excuse, endless meetings, company events, unexpected visitors. Michael tried to understand, to excuse each absence with reasons he didn't even believe himself. Still, he kept defending the woman he'd chosen to share his life with. Until one day, he stopped recognizing himself. One night, he called earlier than usual, unannounced. Jenna answered sounding annoyed. She said she was busy and would call back later. There were voices in the background, muffled laughter, and she hung up before he could ask anything. Michael stayed awake all night, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The next day, she called like nothing had happened, but he was already different. He started noticing details, seeing the effort she made to seem casual. Sometimes, she spoke like she was reading lines. Her words lost weight. Her tone lost soul. Michael decided to surprise her one weekend. He bought a ticket, packed his bags, and sent a message from the airport saying he needed to see her. Jenna tried to hide her shock, saying she was in the middle of a complicated event and might not have time. Still, he went. When he arrived, the apartment door was locked, the lights off. He waited in the car for hours until she finally showed up, accompanied. They were laughing together. When they saw him, Jenna froze. Derek stepped back, but Michael already knew. She approached, pale, and asked to talk in private. Inside the apartment, she started speaking with tears in her eyes. She tried to explain that things had gotten out of control, that she never planned any of it. She said Derek had reached out just to talk, and that the strain of distance and work pressure led her to make a mistake. That she was confused. That she felt alone. She insisted she still loved Michael, that this wasn't who she wanted to be. He listened in silence. He didn't interrupt or react. When she finished, she begged for forgiveness, hands trembling, face desperate. He looked at her steadily, like someone watching a person who no longer exists. Then he picked up the keys from the table, placed them on the couch, and walked out. The divorce happened weeks later. Jenna still tried to fix things. She wrote letters, sent messages, showed up at band rehearsals. Michael ignored every attempt. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was about breaking something much deeper. He felt used, humiliated, deceived by someone who swore she'd stand by him even on the hardest days. The pain settled deep, quiet, like a crack in a wall no one sees from afar but that weakens the whole structure. It changed him inside. It left a space he wasn't sure could ever be filled. And even surrounded by friends and band commitments, he felt too alone. Something inside him had died. And he didn't know how to bury it. The time after the divorce was a desert for Michael. Days lost their names, hours blurred together. He started waking up without purpose, sleeping without rest, eating out of obligation. His guitar, leaning in the corner of the room, felt like a foreign object, as if it no longer belonged to his identity. Music, once his refuge, now felt like a burden. Friends tried to talk, made plans, called him, but Michael avoided it all. Life was happening outside while he stayed trapped in a space where silence never ended. For weeks, Parker was one of the few who kept pushing. He sent funny messages, showed up with beer, played old movies. Parker understood silence and respected emptiness. They'd known each other since high school, shared stages and stories. Parker was the one who introduced Michael to his first serious producer, defended him in fights with shady managers, helped hide the engagement ring before the surprise for Jenna. So when Parker died in an accident, the already cracked ground beneath Michael finally gave way. The news came in a text. A mutual friend wrote, "Parker's gone. Car. Late at night." Michael didn't reply. He just stared at his phone as the world around him faded. Then he got up and locked himself in his room. He stayed there for days, listening to old voice messages, rereading conversations. Parker's laughter now sounded like echoes from a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. In that silent grief, depression took root. He'd wake up but not get out of bed. He'd spend hours staring at the ceiling. Sometimes he thought about going out, but gave up before even putting on his shoes. The band had already fallen apart. The other members went their separate ways after Michael stopped showing up. No one blamed him, but everyone knew it was over. He stopped eating properly, lost weight, began forgetting the lyrics to his own songs. He felt empty, like a background character in his own story. One day, his sister showed up unannounced. She found the apartment silent, messy, and Michael on the couch with an empty bottle beside him. She cried, argued, tried to shake him somehow. He barely responded. After that, she started coming regularly, bringing food, clean clothes, repeating phrases he didn't even register. The following weeks were slow and painful. But his sister's constant presence began to crack his apathy. Michael caught himself listening to a music snippet, then opening his guitar case. He couldn't play long, but it was something. During one visit, she brought an old friend from the local music scene, a guy named Devin who was starting a new project. He said he needed a creative guitarist, wanted something more organic, raw. Michael refused immediately. Said he was out, that it wasn't the right time. Devin thanked him and left. A week later, he came back. Then again after that. The third time, he left a USB drive with 3 unfinished demos on the table. Michael ignored it for 2 days but eventually listened out of curiosity. The sound stirred something long asleep. The third riff sounded exactly like a progression he'd started months before, and it made him pick up his guitar with focus for the first time. He spent the afternoon writing, and the next day, he called Devin. He accepted the offer. That's how the new chapter began. The John Reginald Group wasn't just a band, it was a space for rebuilding. Rehearsals started in small studios with makeshift gear. With every finished song, Michael reclaimed a piece of himself. The other members also carried stories of loss, and that shared pain created a quiet bond between them. No one pushed too hard. Every small step was celebrated. The stage, which for months had been a place of pain, became a place of expression again. During a show on the alternative circuit, Michael saw the audience truly react to a song he wrote in honor of Parker. There were no lyrics, just instrumentals. But the emotion was so clear that the crowd fell silent at the first chord. At the end, they stood and applauded. Michael didn't say a word. He just looked up at the sky, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. He hadn't overcome the pain. But he'd found a place for it inside himself. After that, his routine started to balance again. He began going out, reconnecting with people, reaching out. His sister mentioned a party she was hosting to bring together old friends and suggested he come. Michael thought about saying no, but ended up saying he'd think about it. For the first time in a long time, he considered the possibility of being in a room full of people, conversation, laughter. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but something inside told him it might be worth trying. Michael arrived at the party with no expectations. He'd accepted the invitation more to please his sister than out of real desire. He didn't dress up much, just something simple, and carried that constant alertness that still lived in his body, even on calm days. He'd relearned how to smile in public, to seem okay, to hide the holes still inside him. He was whole enough to keep going, but still too guarded to truly open up. Right at the entrance, he was greeted with enthusiasm. Old friends seemed genuinely happy to see him, and he responded with polite gestures and a few hugs. A couple asked about music, the new band, his routine. Michael gave basic answers. At one point, when he stepped away from the noise, his sister approached with a different kind of smile. Before she even introduced her, he knew this wasn't random. Claire Morgan stood beside her, holding a glass, her gaze calm, the kind that doesn't need to try to be kind. The introduction was quick but effective. Claire spoke little, listened a lot, and Michael, without realizing it, felt at ease. It was different. No forced charm, no rehearsed lines. She didn't seem impressed by the idea of a musician in front of her, and maybe that was the first sign this was out of the ordinary. They talked for a few minutes, and when the music got louder, they moved to a quieter corner of the house. They talked about everything, except past relationships. Claire mentioned her work reading books for the visually impaired, something she volunteered for on Saturday mornings. Michael was surprised by how simple the gesture was. She also said she sometimes spent Sundays helping her grandmother at a community center. Everything she said came naturally, without heroics, without putting herself in the spotlight. Just a good person doing what felt right. And it affected him. At the end of the night, they exchanged contacts. No promises. No games. Michael left with a quiet sense of lightness, like an inner door had cracked open. In the days that followed, he thought about her often. He sent a message 2 days later, suggesting coffee. Claire replied calmly, setting the meeting for the next Saturday. When they met again, the conversation picked up right where it left off, as if no time had passed. Claire was practical but sensitive. Direct, but kind. Michael realized he didn't have to pretend around her. In one conversation, she mentioned she'd read a book about grief and invisible healing. He listened quietly. When she finished, he opened up. He told her about Parker. He shared what he'd been through after his friend's death. Claire didn't say she understood, didn't offer rehearsed comfort. She just listened. And that was more healing than any therapy. Their meetings became regular, movies, walks, live music, long talks about random topics. Claire got to know him slowly, without rush or pressure. Michael was surprised by how she respected his silences, how she never demanded immediate answers. Sometimes he talked about Jenna, and Claire listened without discomfort. She'd just say that some pains take longer to leave the body, and that was okay. None of her words carried competition or comparison. It was like she understood that someone's past doesn't need to be erased for the present to matter. For the first time in years, Michael began sleeping better. Melodies returned to his mind with clarity, lyrics flowed without effort. The band noticed the change. Their shows became more intense, more honest. Fans started to notice. One night, after a powerful performance, Claire was waiting outside. He hugged her with a force that came from deep inside. It wasn't planned. It was pure. Months later, on an ordinary weekend, they sat in silence. Claire held a mug and commented on a movie they'd watched. Michael interrupted and, with a calm that surprised even him, said he loved her. Claire didn't answer with words. She just looked at him for a few seconds and kissed him. In that moment, he realized, it wasn't about forgetting what he'd lived, but about being able to live again, truthfully. The first night they spent together, there was no rush, no pressure. It happened naturally, expected, yet surprising in how it unfolded. Afterward, Michael felt his body and heart finally realign. What they had wasn't an escape or a shelter. It was a choice. A decision. Slowly, they began sharing more of their daily lives, short trips, home-cooked dinners, quiet afternoons, just sharing space. It wasn't a fairy tale. They argued, had scheduling conflicts, disagreed on things. But everything was resolved through conversation, listening, maturity. Michael learned that loving calmly could still be powerful. And that sometimes, the right story begins just when you've accepted there might not be another one to write. The reunion with Jenna wasn't planned. Michael had been in Denver for just over a year, now living with Claire, sharing a home, plans, lazy Sundays, and peaceful silences. The band was doing well. The John Reginald Group had gained recognition in the indie scene, and his songs were praised for their raw honesty. One regular afternoon, leaving the studio after a recording session, he got a short message from his sister, "She's back." No name. No context. But he knew exactly who she meant. That same night, Jenna called. Her voice sounded different, softer, hesitant. She said she needed to see him. That it was important. He stayed quiet. Didn't answer right away. For years, he'd rehearsed this moment, imagined what he'd say, how he'd react. But when it finally came, all he felt was a strange, almost clinical distance. Like it was happening to someone else, a younger, more naive version of himself. 2 days later, he agreed to meet her at a cafe. Jenna arrived early. She looked worn down. Her gaze, once confident and captivating, now carried exhaustion. She said life hadn't turned out as she hoped. That Derek had used her and then disappeared. That her job fell apart. That she'd had a health issue, and only then did she start to understand the damage she'd caused. Michael listened carefully, but without emotion. She cried. Apologized for everything. Said she just wanted forgiveness, that she regretted throwing away what they'd built. He took a deep breath before speaking. He said forgiveness wasn't the issue. That he'd already forgiven her, because he needed to move on. But that didn't mean going back. He told her he knew everything, about Derek's manipulation, the lies, the deliberate betrayal, and that even knowing that, he chose not to carry bitterness. Jenna reached for his hand, but he gently pulled away. He said he was doing well, that he'd rebuilt his life, that he'd found someone who truly loved him, someone who chose to be with him every day, not just the easy ones. Jenna lowered her eyes. She tried to insist, said she still loved him, wanted one more chance, that she could start over. Michael answered firmly. He said their time ended the moment she chose someone else instead of fighting for them. That love can't survive without respect. And that he'd finally understood that. That same night, he came home to find Claire reading on the couch. He sat beside her and told her everything. Didn't hide a thing. Claire listened quietly, and when he finished, she simply said she trusted him. That she was glad he'd finally closed that chapter. Michael was more moved than he expected. Because right there, in that room, he realized how grateful he was to have someone who didn't doubt him. Who didn't demand dramatic explanations. Who just understood. Later that week, he took her to the spot of their first picnic. He prepared everything, the same fruits, the same cheap wine, even the same faded blanket. He waited for her to finish eating, then pulled a small box from his pocket. Claire looked up, surprised. He didn't give a speech. Just opened the box and said, "I want everything with you." She smiled, said yes, and hugged him like someone who knows exactly what they're choosing. The wedding was simple, surrounded by friends, music, and a few honest tears. Instead of a party, they had a special band show. Claire stayed backstage, but danced through every song. After that, life settled the way they dreamed. They bought a small house, adopted a dog, traveled to new places, argued over silly things, made up with hot chocolate, learned to live with each other's quirks. It wasn't a perfect story. It was real. Jenna disappeared from their lives for good. Michael never looked for her again. Not out of spite, but by choice. He decided to live the present with the intensity he'd always wanted, and now that present had a name, a scent, morning laughter, and support on hard days. When their son was born months later, Michael cried in the hospital holding the baby. He looked at Claire and knew everything he'd been through had led him exactly to this moment. The pain, the loss, the betrayal, the grief, everything had been the bridge to the love he deserved to live. And in that instant, with the child sleeping on his chest, he understood that forgiveness was essential, but starting over was a decision. And he'd made it with his whole heart. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.